This week, Brian Contos from Phosphorus is with us to discuss IoT trends, stories, and threat prevention. Then Isabelle Roccia from the International Association of Privacy Professionals joins us to talk about privacy in Europe and why it matters. Finally, in the enterprise security news, not much funding this week, but Netskope did raise $400 million, and Hack the Box raises $55 million. Also, what went wrong with IronNet? The open source index highlights popular security projects. Windows 7 and Windows 8.1 have been put out to pasture officially. Predictions about personal cybersecurity, cloud security trends, the ongoing impact of ChatGPT on the security industry, and password hygiene revealed to be terrible in the U.S. government. All that and more on this episode of Enterprise Security Weekly.
This is Security Weekly, for security professionals, by security professionals. Broadcasting live from G-Unit Studios in Rhode Island, it's the show where we talk security vendors and aren't afraid to name names. It's Enterprise Security Weekly.
The cybersecurity landscape is full of single solution providers, making it easy for unexpected cyber threats to sneak through the cracks. That's why Fortra is creating a stronger, simpler strategy for protection, one that increases your security maturity while decreasing the operational burden that comes with it. This is all possible thanks to Fortra's best-in-class portfolio and deep bench of expert problem solvers. Fortra's integrated, scalable solutions help customers face their toughest challenges with confidence. Learn more at securityweekly.com/Fortra.
Welcome to Enterprise Security Weekly and happy National Marzipan Day. This is episode 302, recorded on Thursday, January 12th, 2022. I'm your host, Adrian Sanabria, and joining me today is the Professor of Pandemonium and the Mayor of Mayhem, Tyler Shields. How are you, Professor?
I love the name. Thank you. I'm doing well, Adrian. Good to hear you.
Have you had enough time to look up what marzipan is?
I was clicking away as you were typing. I definitely looked up marzipan. I knew what it was. It's like a cheesy substance, but like a sweetie cheesy substance that's used in cooking, right?
I wouldn't describe it as cheesy, but
got the
like
consistency of it.
It's almond based. Yeah, it's like a paste. I can see why you would call it cheesy, but yeah, the taste is nothing like cheese. I kind of grew up with it, so I love it.
And so I was thinking, like, when I was thinking cheesy taste or cheesy consistency, I was thinking like a mozzarella.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, certainly cutting into it, yeah, I can see that. But certainly when you put it in your mouth, you're not going to think cheese.
I know it from, and correct me if I'm wrong, and all the Italians out there will correct me if I'm wrong here, but if I remember right, marzipan is used in maybe cannolis or some of those Italian sweets I grew up on.
Yeah, so I actually have a question. Let me introduce our next co-host because I have a question there. So also joining me is the Czar of Zero Trust, the Sultan of Substack, Katie Teitler. How are you, Katie?
I'm baffled by your understanding of marzipan, Tyler. Baffled.
So in North Boston, there's a place called Mike's Pastries. Is that right?
There is Mike's Pastry. Yeah.
And if you go in there, they have all these tiny little marzipan creations where they dye the marzipan. And it's like little hot dogs and hamburgers and all kinds of cute little, like they don't even look edible. They look so good, but they're all made out of marzipan, right?
Yeah. Yeah, 100%. I grew up on marzipan cookies in the Italian neighborhoods where I grew up. So and I had to Google them to remember them because I'm so old. But as soon as I Googled it, I'm like, yeah, those are the things I ate growing up.
Yeah, so
my mom is the biggest fan of marzipan. In fact, if she doesn't get marzipan for Christmas from us, she is not happy. So yeah, definitely marzipan is a thing.
That is the voice of the Baron of Bloodhound, the Pirate King of PowerShell himself, Sean Metcalf.
Hi, Adrian. How's it going?
It's going
so
good.
Last week,
and
birds. Now it's marzipan. So we've shifted from the outside to the indoors and the sweets.
You know, it is also National Curried Chicken Day, though. Because I had to look it up just to guess which Adrian was going to go for. So we could have gone savory.
And fun fact, chicken is a bird. I looked it up.
Chicken is a bird.
And we connect to last week. Well done.
Yes.
I did. I was tempted to go that way, but it just. I mean, there's nothing funny about it. Like it's curried chicken. Everybody loves curried chicken. Like marzipan was definitely the more interesting pick, I think. And it's funny, Sean, you mentioned Christmas, because that's how I got into marzipan. Is every year my grandparents in Puerto Rico would send up like a care package, a box of stuff every Christmas. We get some coquito, we get some marzipan, we get some brazo gitano, which is like a jelly roll, like imagine a single layer of cake, and you spread jelly on it, and then roll the whole thing up, and then cut it into slices, and that's a brazo gitano. And
sounds amazing.
Yeah, it was just something I look forward to every Christmas. Of course, I did. When I was growing up, I didn't get to indulge in the coquito. It's like a alcoholic eggnog. Yeah.
Oh, it's delicious. Yeah.
Yep.
My wife Candace was in Puerto Rico just after Thanksgiving, and she picked up a bottle of coquito and brought it back. And we have a good friend who's Puerto Rican who made it fresh, and it's amazing. It's so great.
Very good stuff, indeed. All right, we've got a quick announcement here. Thank you for listening or watching our podcast. We want to ensure we are creating the most relevant and useful content for our audience across our network. So it's crucial to us that we get some feedback from you. Please take a few minutes to complete our listener survey so that we can craft our content based on your needs. Visit securityweekly.com/survey to submit your feedback. And we meet weekly and we talk about this stuff, and this isn't something that's, if you take the time to submit this, be assured it's going to get looked at. We're going to take your thoughts into consideration. All right, so today's first interview, the topic is IoT, OT network device attacks, trends, stories, and threat prevention. And we're excited to have Brian Contos with us today to talk about this. He's the Chief Security Officer at Phosphorus, who does a lot of really cool research on IoT. Welcome, Brian.
Hey, welcome, guys. Thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's there's so much here. We kind of have to decide, what we jump into, what we talk about. So, I think first of all, you mentioned XIoT a lot, and if I don't cheat and I just guess, I would assume the X is a placeholder for just anything IoT, right? Like enterprise IoT, consumer IoT, industrial IoT. Is that pretty much what the X is there for?
It stands for basically extended IoT.
Oh, okay.
And the way we look at that, it's generally three categories. It's enterprise IoT, which is kind of what most of us think of when we think of IoT. It's the printers, the KVM switches, the UPS systems, voice over IP phones, door locks, those types of smart devices you find in the enterprise. The other section are OT devices, SCADA equipment, industrial IoT. These are PLCs. These are digital devices that control physics, things like flow and pressure and temperature and volume, and move mechanical arms. And then the third category, these are just network devices. These are things like NAS, load balancers, and switches. Now, collectively, what all these devices and extended IoT have in common is that, one, they're generally running on purpose-built hardware and software. They're doing a thing, like they're recording video or they're printing paper. They're lacking the ability to put some type of traditional IT security tool on them, like an endpoint security control, antivirus, anti-malware controls like that. And because of that, it opens them up to a high level of risk. So these purpose-built devices running purpose-built firmware that you cannot install security controls on, that kind of fits in our world of what we call XIoT.
Now, would you include medical devices in there as well, or is that more of a different category?
I would. In fact, so if you look across like healthcare providers, payers and services, certainly on the research side of it, you've got pharmaceuticals. So they have a whole bunch of batch manufacturing juxtaposed to a car assembly line, which is more discrete manufacturing. So they've got those devices. But for the provider side, everything from an MRI machine to insulin pumps. We don't focus particularly on devices that go inside people. There's a lot of smart devices now that can be inside the human body. Also smart buildings, smart ships, smart cities. There's military equipment as well. So this is a very extensive and rapidly growing environment in XIoT.
Before we jump into any specific examples here, at the, as we neared 2023 and people started posting their prediction blog posts and stuff like that, I look back a couple years because every now and then I think, I wonder what we were predicting a couple years ago and how accurate some of those predictions were. And there was a lot of IoT. If you go back 3 to 5 years, maybe even a little further than that, everybody was really worried about IoT devices coming into the home. And I found it interesting because, to me, I don't know. I guess I didn't really see and maybe criminals didn't either, see the motivation there, a way to make money off that stuff. And I feel like that never really came to pass. And we have seen a lot of that, but more with like the industrial and enterprise IoT stuff. I feel like, is that just my perception, or how much of that rings true to you?
Yeah, I think historically that was really accurate. And I will just say one little plug before I get in there, that we're just coming out of the holiday season. And a lot of devices that people got over the holidays, they got this cool new IoT personal device. They're taking them back into the office. Now, these devices, while they wouldn't traditionally be used in enterprise, we see crossover with like printers and cameras. There are some devices that cross over, and there's some devices that don't. So sometimes you're introducing a personal device into a enterprise, and then it just kind of throws everything out of whack because it's really easy to get them online, and we'll kind of get to that in a moment. But the first thing I'll state is volume, right? So just to do some comparisons, there's about 10 million servers in the cloud. All right, and I'm not counting virtual machines. I'm actually counting just physical servers. That's roughly about the number of horses. There's a few more horses, but just to use some type of comparative number. When you look at devices that are desktops and actually have a keyboard, laptops, desktops, et cetera, there's about 5 billion of those, right? And there's a few billion more people than that. So we're going from horses to people, from cloud to endpoint. But now we look at XIoT. There's about 50 billion plus XIoT devices. And while the number of devices with keyboards is going down extremely rapidly, the number of XIoT devices is increasing even faster than that. So we're seeing them absolutely everywhere. So what does that mean? From a cyber criminal perspective, from a nation state attacker perspective, there's just a very rich target environment for them to go after. And if you think about it, most of these devices on the enterprise level, they're Linux servers. They're running Ubuntu. They're running BusyBox. They might be running BSD on the network device side. They might be running VxWorks or some other type of real-time operating system on the OT side. But these are relatively common operating systems, and by and large, Linux is the most common. Now, the other thing to think about is these aren't necessarily underpowered devices. I've seen security cameras that are more powerful than my laptop. They have more memory, better CPU, they have large storage capability, internet connectivity, all the things that you'd want, but they just happen to be security cameras. So there's a number of types of attacks that we think about when we think about XIoT. The first one is just opportunistic stuff. And we can go into a few examples, but opportunistic attacks is, hey, I'm just going to take your device and turn it into a botnet. Okay, fine. And we see that across OT, we see that across IoT and network devices. The second type of attack is, I'm going to cause a physical issue. I'm going to unlock a door. I'm going to use a security camera to spy on you, recording your audio and video and piping it out. I'm going to impact an OT device and make it spin out of control or something catch on fire, something that's going to cause a physical issue. The third category, and this is the one that's really been picking up steam in the last few years, are pivot attacks. And a pivot attack is essentially, I might get in for a traditional phishing attack and get onto someone's laptop, but I know I'm going to get caught because you've got endpoint security and network security and application security and data security. So if I want to maintain persistence and evade detection, I want to look for an XIoT device to hang out. And we'll get into some of the stats, but the interesting thing about that is there isn't going to just be one. There's going to be thousands or tens of thousands. And the good part for the attacker is most of those devices have default passwords. They've got old firmware. They're running all types of protocols, so they're easy to access, and no one's watching them. So they get access to these devices now. They got in through IT. Now they pivot to XIoT, and they use XIoT devices to maintain that persistence, evade detection, while attacking the IT devices, such as stealing sensitive data and exfiltrating it out. Again, They're Linux servers. They can run SSH. They can run SCP. They can run FTP. They can run TFTP. They can install tools. So these are very capable systems. And that's kind of the category of what we're seeing. And I think that's how things have changed in the last few years, from like the Mirai botnets of the world were just very opportunistic, to now we have very targeted attacks by cyber criminals that have learned how to monetize the exploitation of these devices, as well as nation states that are now building purpose-built tools to find, attack, compromise, and control XIoT devices. So it's a completely new world in this space.
Yeah, and it's part of the business model now, right? Like giving access to networks and to devices is totally, that like there are criminal groups out there that just specialize in getting that initial access, right? And maybe that is a security camera.
It is. So here's a great example. There was a attack that was talked about quite a bit last year called RSOX. It was actually a takedown between the U.S., the UK, Germany, and a few other countries. It was a Russian cyber criminal run botnet. Now, this botnet targeted primarily OT devices. So they were really going after industrial control systems, not to destroy anything, just to add them to their botnet. They also had some traditional enterprise IoT. And they also had a few network devices, but it was predominantly OT. And they weren't attacking these devices again because they were trying to cause destruction, which a lot of people relate to OT. They just happened to be on accessible device. And because they were accessible, they could install some malware. They could make these devices part of that botnet. And RSOX was actually so well created that they were renting it out for about $30 a day for people that wanted to do DDoS attacks, distribute malware, phishing scams, what have you. And I think if you paid like $100 a day, you could also get 24/7 tech support to help you out with it. So it was very sophisticated, very monetized, and they didn't attack it for them to use directly. They attacked it specifically so they could rent it out. And we're seeing some botnets now that their aggregate computing and bandwidth capability, again, made up of XIoT, rivals like Google and Amazon. So these are massive, massive botnets. And again, that's just on the opportunistic side of the house.
It's funny. My next thought when you said that was, I wonder if the criminals offshore their tech support, if they like,
well, you know what's, really what's so funny
like
about
business,
this,
right?
You're probably, and you mentioned looking at this a few years ago, and people were saying, oh, watch out for IoT. The Mirai botnet was about 2016, 2017. And for those who aren't familiar, that's kind of considered the grandfather of IoT attacks. It was very simple. They used a tool like Shodan. And they said, hey, show me all the cameras that are internet accessible right now. And again, most XIoT attacks aren't launched from devices that happen to be internet accessible, although there are plenty of them that are. I'll talk a little bit about that later. But they said, show me all these devices that are internet accessible. And it came back with about 4.5 million, plus or minus. If you do that today, that's about what you'll find. Further, they said, okay, of those devices, which ones are running Telnet? So I said, okay, let me look for port 23 on these guys. Okay, great. Based on that, which ones have either the default passwords that we know are on most of these cameras, or one of about a half a dozen other commonly used passwords? And based on that, they were able to put together these extremely powerful botnets because they found those devices, they were internet accessible. They didn't have to hack them. They logged in through Telnet. Once they were able to get access, they added some malware. They were able to control. They had full command and control. Well, here's a really interesting part of that. This was, again, back 2016, 2017. Very quickly, they discovered, because of all the white labeling that's done in this space, because of all the shared libraries, because there's not really strong security development lifecycle practices being done across XIoT. A lot of these devices have very little to no security in mind during development. That not only were these cameras vulnerable, but a lot of voice over IP phones used the same code, and printers and audio video equipment and smart TVs. So now, instead of just 4.5 million security cameras, they had tens of millions of different devices that, again, just happened to be internet accessible, running these default passwords with these same types of issues on them. We go into organizations today, it's 2023 now, again, Mirai was back 2016, 17, that are still vulnerable to Mirai because a lot of these devices never get patched. And what's even worse, we go into organizations today where we find devices that aren't just still vulnerable, but they're actually running Mirai on them. they've been compromised. But as long as my printer is still printing and my security camera is still recording and my door lock is still opening and closing my doors, no one's paying attention to these devices. And they haven't been updated for a decade. So that's kind of gets to the core of some of the problems with these devices is old firmware, bad passwords, tons of vulnerabilities, and nobody really even knows what they have. And what we found in our research, and this number really, we had to really look at this closely because it just seemed like too many, but it turned out to be right. There's about 3 to 5 XIoT devices per employee in an organization. So a 10,000 person organization has somewhere between 30 to 50,000. Now there's a bit of a bell curve for that. Law firms, for example, they're going to have a little bit less. Retailers are going to have a heck of a lot more. In fact, a lot of these big box stores, they have, they have over 10,000. And there's stuff that I had no idea was online. We're finding ovens and cleaning device like dishwashers that are running Linux. There's a lot of Ubuntu out there. It's usually Ubuntu 10 from like a decade ago for some reason. They found one and they just stuck to it. Deep fryers, like who thought of that, right? Not to mention all the cameras and the door locks and the shipping and receiving and everything else that's around there. You're just blown away. Fast food restaurants as well. So we're seeing it everywhere is the point of what I'm trying to say.
Signage is huge. Like there's so many signs, you know, that like you don't want to have to go to the sign to change it, right? You know, like, so digital signs are huge. Like I just saw somebody, I think registered the domain for a sign company that went out of business. And basically, like, he could take control of all these signs that were still up and functional, and he could put like whatever he wanted on these signs. And now he's trying to help customers like take control back of their signs since his company went under, and they let the domain, that updated and controlled these things lapse.
It's crazy, and but there is a bit of shining light. People are starting to say, hey, you know what? I'm realizing now that these are actually computers that are just as powerful, if not more powerful than my laptop. They're running Linux. They can get out to the internet. They can do all these things. And they're just vulnerable devices that I don't even know if I have them. And roughly 80% of organizations we go into have no idea what they have. The other 20% kind of have an idea, but their numbers are always off. They go, oh, I forgot to count UPS systems or smart racks and cabinets and all these other things that are important. One that was really interesting are UPS systems. And I'll put you on the spot a little bit here, but I think you'll be able to guess. What do you think is one of the most common UPS systems out there, brand name wise?
APC?
APC. You guessed right. If you go on to Shodan now, I'm not suggesting anybody do this, but you look for a UPS system, chances are it's going to be an APC. And you're going to say, Brian, nobody would have a UPS system connected to the internet. What would the use case be out of that? You're going to find about 15,000. Now, let's say, I'm being generous here. Let's say 5% of those, which it's not, but let's say 5% are honeypots. Okay. There's still a lot of these things online that don't, and again, most XIoT attacks don't come directly from the internet. They pivot from IT first. But they've got these systems online. That's bad enough, because usually if you have a UPS system, you bought it for a reason, and that reason is you have something important plugged into it. Now, this will blow your mind. The most popular password on an APC UPS system is the default password that you can Google. If you type in default password for APC UPS, it's going to say APC for username in lowercase and APC for password in lowercase. That's it. I guarantee you, out of those 15,000 plus or minus that you can find on Shodan, APC will get you in. And we have a running joke within Phosphorus that basically says, if we ever go to a customer and we find an APC UPS system and the password and username aren't APC, we'll buy everybody in the company a steak dinner. So we've been eating a lot of chicken. Nobody ever changes these things. They get installed and they stay that way forever. The passwords, the firmware, all the default ports that were opened up. And a lot of these devices, not just UPS systems, but think of cameras and things like that. Someone's showing up with a truck with a whole bunch of boxes and a drill, and they're mounting these things to a wall, and they're connecting fiber optic cable or RJ45 or whatever it is. And they're physically putting these things together. They're engineers. They're not security specialists. They're fine with the password being whatever the default is. And once they're installed and working, that's it. And you go into a company and you say, well, who's responsible for these? And it's like the end of Spider-Man. Everyone's pointing at the other person. Oh, it's the security team. No. It's network ops. No, I think we outsource it. No, it's facilities. And the reason they don't know, or they don't want to admit it, is because a few years ago, the only way to update these systems and manage them was to arm somebody with a paper clip and a USB thumb drive and say, I need you to physically reset every one of these devices and install that. I might have 50,000 cameras. We have customers that have over 100,000.
And maybe a few of them don't come back after you do that. And you lose a few. So what does that teach you to do? Never touch them, ever.
Never touch them.
Don't update them.
Right? It's working. And that takes us back to what we initially discussed. Cyber criminals. We talked a little bit about our SOCs. That was a very basic one. They're taking note of this. But there's a new attack that came out that Mandiant discovered at early 2022 called Quiet Exit. And it basically follows that pivot philosophy that we talked about before. They get in through a phishing attack, probably, through email, social media messaging, whatever. That's just the easiest point of entry. A large company, you're going to get in through a phishing attack, period. So they get in. Once they get there, to maintain persistent evade detection, they look for XIoT devices. And they know there's not going to be one, there's not going to be hundreds, there's going to be thousands or tens of thousands they can camp out on. They were exfiltrating data from there because what they were doing once they were installed on these XIoT devices, a lot of network devices, and they were using reverse SSH tunnels for those through Dropbear. They were actually making API calls to the local exchange and Office 365 in the cloud. And they're grabbing all the emails, all the attachments, all the sensitive data they could find, compressing it up, and then exfiltrating it over ICMP. Because nobody ever shuts it off, and some network administrator turned it on and said, well, who could ever exfiltrate data over ICMP, because he didn't talk to the security team, and they're exfiltrating it out. In most cases, these attacks went on for at least 2 years before they were ever detected. And could you imagine how hard it would be for that organization to go through and try to address that when it's installed on tens of thousands of devices that nobody's monitoring? So that's the cyber criminal side, maybe a little bit of nation state stuff involved there. But you look at the nation states that have said, hey, why bang our heads against firewalls and all these other security controls when no one's looking at these devices? And the attack surface is huge. So Russia created a tool called Frontin. And Frontin was specifically designed to find, attack, compromise, and control XIoT devices to whatever your end goal is, usually sensitive data theft. Unfortunately, this was built by contractors for the Russian FSB. It wasn't very well secured. Digital Revolution Hacking Group discovered that they had this tool. They said this is something far too powerful to be in the hands of the Russian government, the FSB, and they stole it. And they actually uploaded it to a bunch of your favorite torrents. I won't say where you could find it, but most of our listeners probably know where they can find tools like that. And if you speak Russian, or you can use Google Translate from Russian to English or whatever language you want to do, you too can have a military-grade XIoT hacking tool. That's probably one of the best tools out there for discovering your XIoT devices as well, because you have no idea what you have. And these are really powerful tools. So again, they've taken interest. And the reason they're putting time and resources, the cyber criminals in the nation states, is because it works and no one's looking.
Wow. Yeah. So somebody in the chat asked, well, what can you do with a printer with an open port? And it reminded me of a story. And before I tell the story, I think it's an excellent point that they bring up. Maybe not intentionally, but a lot of these devices have different characteristics. A printer can print things. A camera can see things. What can that camera see? So sure, maybe there's a powerful tool inside, but there's also the additional aspects of risk that come from whatever characteristic that IoT device has. Like you were talking about earlier, like fryers and stuff like that, potentially do some damage with some of these industrial and maybe restaurant and enterprise IoT tools. But the story with the printers, the same year that Mirai became a thing, 2016, there's a hacker named Weave. I don't know if you remember this, but turned out to be a white supremacist, fled the U.S. after doing some jail time here. And in 2016, he decided, you know what? There's a lot of printers with the raw JetDirect port just open to the internet, right?
Yeah.
So he just started sending Nazi Nazi propaganda to all these printers, and universities all over the U.S. and all over the world had this neo-Nazi propaganda just spitting out of their printers. And it's again, it's the same reason that Mirai worked. Like this stuff had been sitting on the internet vulnerable. And this isn't even a vulnerability. It's just, if you've ever scanned your home network and you have port 9100 open, you've probably noticed every time that scan runs, you get a printout with just like, some random stuff on it. It'll print whatever you send it. And it just took, this guy to realize, hey, like, here's an opportunity. I can just write a script that will send this propaganda to any printer in the entire world. And there were millions at the time, millions of printers had that port open. So,
well, printers are interesting. They're pretty interesting because we like to say they're promiscuous. Every time I look at a printer now, I think of Nelly Furtado's song "Promiscuous Boy." I don't know why. That's me. There's a glitch in the matrix. So the reason, what I mean by promiscuous with these guys is they want to be connected to. They want you to print, and they want you to print because they want to sell you more ink. So they come default with wired and wireless open, Bluetooth, sometimes Bluetooth low energy, BLE. They've got Telnet, they've got SSH, they've got FTP, TFTP, HTTP, HTTPS, so on, so on, and so on. So they want to be connected to, they want to make it easy. And that's a good thing from an operational perspective. You don't want it to be hard to get connected, but it leaves all that open. Also, the bigger enterprise printers, they've got about an 80 gig hard drive. By today's standards, that's not big, it's not small, but it's good enough to install a bunch of tools, download and steal a bunch of data, and exfiltrate it out. And again, they're just Linux servers. There's no real weirdness about it. When you log in, and whether it's BusyBox or whatever it is, you have all the same controls and capabilities that you would have running Linux on your laptop. So when they get in these printers, organizations don't just have one. We have a hotel chain that's a customer of ours. They have over 50,000 printers, just printers, all different shapes and sizes. And they didn't really even have their arms around how many printers they had, let alone which version were they on, what ports were open, did they have strong passwords? And you start getting into passwords. Again, that's the easiest way to get into these devices. 50% of all XIoT devices are running default passwords that you can Google and find within less than a second, just like we talked about the APC UPS. So again, if you're a 50,000 person corporation, or I'm sorry, 10,000 person corporation, you've got 50,000 XIoT devices. That means I've got 25,000 plus or minus Linux servers with default passwords running around my network. If I told you had 25,000 IT devices, you'd jump off this right now and go fix them. You're like, that's insane. But that's the reality of it. And that's why, again, the nation states and the cyber criminals are really perking up around this thing. But if that's not enough, we take security cameras, which are by far one of the most compromised. We're working with a casino that noticed that they were compromised. And I'd love to say it was from some security analysts, but it was the person that pays their power bill. Now, I don't know, but I'm guessing a casino has a really high power bill. And they noticed that their power bill was substantially higher than it was before. That's because people had crypto-jacked their cameras and they were mining cryptocurrency. Everybody here knows cryptocurrency is a bit of a power drain. And it was so much of a power drain, it was so successful on all these cameras that they noticed, hey, our power bill is going way up. So you see things abused like that. But I think that's go ahead.
That's kind of poetically beautiful, though. Like making money off casinos' surveillance cameras. That's poetry right there.
Yeah,
I feel like.
I mean, it's so fun. You go into some of these organizations, and I see it in the DoD side, sometimes in some of the civilian agencies as well. But you've got some cameras that their only job is to monitor that other cameras are still there and no one's messing with them. So they got a lot. But some of your listeners might know this, but in November of 2022, so just a couple months ago now, there was a U.S. House of Representative, HR 5515. You can go ahead and look that up. And basically was calling out Chinese-built cameras, Huawei, ZTE, Hikvision. There's several others. But these are very popular, very common cameras. Well, the problem was if you said stop recording audio and stop recording video, some of these devices would turn the green light to red. but they'd still record audio and they'd still record video. And what was even worse is they're piping this video out to a remote location for analysis, and whether people are doing pattern discovery, anomaly detection, temporal-based analysis, whatever types of algorithms. You can think about some of these cameras are in very sensitive areas. Some of them are set up in executive conference rooms and boardrooms and sensitive military areas as well. But in November, they changed it from a bill to just say it's now illegal to import or sell any of these cameras within the United States. Before, they just said you shouldn't use it, so we're not going to allow it in the government. We're not going to allow government contractors to use it, but now it's illegal to sell or use. So that's a big step up. That's actually a big step. Say what you want about technology and the U.S. government's ability to understand and legislate around it, but they actually put their foot down and said, enough of this. And that was a very blatant one. But I will tell you this, I get the opportunity to travel all over the world, and I was at GITEX in Dubai. And one of the big sponsors there was one of those camera companies. And everywhere I go, I see those cameras installed. So it's just because the United States has said stop, it doesn't mean the rest of the world still isn't using this and still isn't being abused because of these. So,
right. Yeah, so that kind of takes us in a good direction that I want to go with this, with the time that we have remaining in like, how do we solve this problem? How do we start to address this? And I think Sean had some questions here.
Absolutely. Thank you. So we know that IoT devices are vulnerable, and there's lots of consumer devices out there on the internet. Have you seen attackers leverage one to get to the other to gain more access and control? And how can we limit what they're able to do in those situations?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So I kept on talking about the pivot attack of going from an IT device to an XIoT device. But if the first XIoT device you land on is something that's not quite as powerful as you want, maybe it's a layer 2 switch or something of that nature, you want to pivot from that to get something a little juicier, a camera, a printer, a door lock control system, something like that. So we do see that. And a lot of that is the traditional means that people use to enumerate networks and scan, et cetera. Now, back to my point I made earlier, the nefarious actors, they understand that 50% of those devices are going to have default passwords. And the ones that don't are filled with CVEs. Even the ones that do have a password, there's no rotation frequency because a lot of these aren't integrated with PAM tools like CyberArk, HashiCorp, Thycotic. And a lot of those tools can't talk directly to XIoT. They need an enterprise XIoT management platform in order to do that. So there's no rotation frequency. They're not enforcing complexity. Some of these devices, the older ones, only allow like a 4-digit numeric PIN. The newer ones do allow longer, complex passwords, kind of following best practices. But I would say roughly 90% plus of organizations don't have good password management practices deployed on their XIoT devices. So again, the bad guys will come in, eventually get to a device, but then they'll start spreading out to all the devices they can. And why stop? They'll go ahead and enumerate your entire network and do anything they need to do to find those devices and compromise them. And again, because they're Linux servers, they can use their same tools anywhere they go. So that's a pretty popular use case. If they do run into a situation where they're like, I really want to get into this device, but they actually put a password on there. This is really interesting. The firmware that's running on XIoT devices, the average age, and we've seen stuff that's much older, but is 6 years. So imagine trying to just operate your, smartphone with the OS hasn't been upgraded for just even a couple years. It probably wouldn't even work. The app certainly wouldn't.
Yeah, if you can.
But 6 years old. Yeah, so 75% of these devices, forget the passwords now, are running 6-year-old firmware. And the other 26%, 74% of the firmware is actually end of life. I'm sorry, I'm getting my numbers backwards in my head. 26% of the firmware is end of life. 74% of the remaining firmware is average 6 years old. So that end of life firmware, you can't really do anything on those devices but try to harden them. Turn off those extra services, make sure you've got good password rotation, manage your certs. Almost all the certs are expired or self-signed or cryptologically insecure, expired. So this is basic hygiene stuff. And then when you go beyond that, what you find is because it's got that old firmware, like I said, that 26% end of life firmware and 74% is over 6 years old, you find that about 68%, almost 70% have level 8, 9, and 10 CVEs. So what's that mean? It means half the time I'm just going to be able to log in with absolutely no problem at all. Boom, I'm in. The other half of those systems, there's a good chance that they're going to have a bunch of ports open. There's going to be a high-level vulnerability, probably a level 8, 9, or 10, so even some criticals. And I'm going to be able to exploit that with relative ease and get access to that system. And that's a pretty interesting situation. Now I can jump between KVM switches and lights out management, UPS and printers and door locks and voice over IP phones and everything else with great ease. So again, a short answer to that is absolutely they do that. And they want to get embedded in as many devices as they can to maintain persistence and evade that detection.
So one of the things that you mentioned is hygiene. Obviously, hygiene on these systems, disabling unused protocols, ports. We know that doesn't happen, right? And IoT device management is obviously a problem. Azure and other cloud providers have an IoT platform. Certainly, there's personal IoT devices that are brought in and connected in a corporate network, as you mentioned, in a company, and also the necessary corporate devices as well. You mentioned the devices from APC and others. But what's the answer to all these unmanaged IoT devices in corporate environments for both the personal ones and the corporate ones that need to be there?
Yeah. So there's a new breed of security solution out there. It's not a firewall. It's not a vulnerability scanner. It's not a SIEM. They're called enterprise IoT security platforms, or if I was to name it, it would be enterprise XIoT security platforms. And what these devices do is they're usually VMs. They've been Dockerized. I've seen a lot of them that can run in the cloud as well, or you can run them on-prem, but usually run them on-prem, to be honest. And they operate as kind of a combination of a traditional scanner, although they're not scanning for vulnerabilities, and maybe an asset management solution. And what they try to do is they sort of step through your environment looking for anything that falls into the XIoT category so that at least you know what you have. Okay, now you go ahead and you said, okay, I've safely and as accurately as possible, certainly more accurately than I have before, I've identified these devices. Now, a lot of the old school systems that some people have tried to use for IoT, it breaks. And these are great solutions. I'm talking about Qualys and Tenable and Rapid7. They were never designed for this. So if you unleash IT security controls, scanners and things of that nature in this world, you end up knocking things over, especially in the OT SCADA world. No one's going to let you go into their SCADA environment and sort of do these things. So you need something that's actually purpose-built and can actually communicate in the language that all these devices do. Now, if you're able to do that, then you can have sort of active discovery. Well, people say, well, what about sniffing? What if I use some of the solutions to just sniff traffic? Sniffing traffic's fine, but when again, you're talking about tens and tens and tens of thousands of XIoT devices, that's a lot of taps. That's a lot of span ports. That's a lot of investment in your switching infrastructure to make sure you can do that. Generally speaking, it's too expensive, and a lot of the communication's encrypted. So if you're actually trying to determine what a device actually is and not just say, oh, I saw a JetDirect port, it's probably a printer, but you're not really sure. In this world, you have to be 100%, because if you go to the next step, which is remediation, which is upgrading firmware, rotating passwords, hardening devices, updating certs, you don't want to turn someone's $2 million MRI machine into a $200 HP BubbleJet printer. People tend to get upset if you do that. So if you have really, really accurate discovery, which a lot of these platforms do, you can find out what you have, and then you can take it to the next step. Now I want to update all of my cameras in building A at midnight tonight, or I want to do all my printers from version 6 to version 7. Or there's a log4j vulnerability on version 7 of my printer's firmware. They're not going to have version 8 out for another 6 months, but everybody and their cousins looking for log4j vulnerabilities, so maybe I even want to downgrade that. That would be completely unheard of in the days of paper clips and USB thumb drives, because you'd have to arm a football team of people with it to go fix these. So you just never do it. But now you can actually move pretty quickly around that upgrading, downgrading firmware, and knows how to follow the upgrade path. Like I can go from 6 to 8, or I have to go 6, 7 to 8. So if you have active discovery that's actually interrogating these devices and understanding not just IP and MAC address, because that's not actually a good measure for these devices, but things like what's your serial number, what's your firmware number, what are you using for your passwords, what's all the metadata that I have to know so I can accurately understand what you are, and I can then say, well, do we want to turn off clear text protocols? Do you want to upgrade your firmware? Do we want to enroll this device in a PAM solution like a CyberArk so we can rotate the password every 90 days and force a complex password? That's the solution. And if you think about it, this is security like back from the early 90s. Tell me what I got. When I find it, make sure it's got good passwords and change those passwords. Make sure you keep it up to date and patched. Turn off extraneous services and make sure you've got a solid cert. this isn't crazy stuff. We're just taking the basics, the bare bone basics of IT, and now applying it to the XIoT world. And that's really how you get your arms around this. And it's actually a pretty slick approach to it. And again, it's a completely new arena, but it's one that if you ever go to the IoT hacking villages at DEF CON and things like that, that's kind of the solution to these problems, right? Beyond, dissecting stuff and pulling apart the hardware and seeing if I can fuzz something. That's all great. That adds a ton of value. But operationally in an enterprise environment, how can I affect change at scale? And these XIoT security platforms or IoT security platforms, this is kind of what they do.
Yeah. And that's I think it's one of those things where we just have to get people to focus on the issue enough. You just always have that issue. Well, my IoT devices haven't bit me in the butt yet. So I'm just going to wait until that opportune moment when we have a breach to say, oh, okay, now we'll do it. But yeah. The stories of this stuff being installed for years and siphoning off emails and stuff like that. Yeah, I just don't think people can afford to do that. They're going to have to track and repair this stuff. Brian, it's been awesome today. I know we've got some great resources in the show notes. Do you have any talks coming up that you're giving?
Yeah, a ton of talks. So I've got a bunch of B-sides that I'll be at and future cons. But we're going to be at the big S4 conference is the newest one coming up, and that's going to be out in Florida, Miami, Florida. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I've heard a lot of good.
Anybody
wants
that. If anybody wants to come check it out, we set up a really cool both virtual and physical capture the flag with a bunch of devices, and all the way from sort of beginner level people to really advanced stuff. So if anyone's going to be out there at S4, great event, come by. I guess we have a whole room. Phosphorus has a whole room there, but I'll be there. We'll have an awesome capture the flag thing. We're going to do some really fun stuff. So if people actually want to get hands-on and seeing how easy and fun, to be honest, it is to hack these devices and mess around with them, and they want to actually enroll in the capture the flag competitions, and there's prizes and stuff like that, please come on by S4. Happy to, and ask for me, and I'm happy to show you some stuff.
That sounds like a blast. Brian, thank you so much for joining us on Enterprise Security Weekly today.
Thank you. This has been a blast. Appreciate it.
All right, stay tuned. When we come back, we're going to talk perspectives on privacy in Europe with Isabelle Roccia from the IAPP.
The shift to remote and hybrid work The shift to remote and hybrid work over the past 2 years has accelerated application development on cloud infrastructure. However, securing these new assets has lagged behind. Qualys CloudView, the next generation of cloud security posture management, delivers an end-to-end multi-cloud security and compliance solution encompassing the entire application lifecycle from build to runtime. CloudView enables enterprises to assess their cloud security and compliance posture, identify risks and gaps, auto-remediate issues, proactively enforce best practices, and prove compliance in audits rapidly and efficiently. Identify your most vulnerable cloud assets by visiting securityweekly.com/Qualys.
Welcome back to Enterprise Security Weekly. Follow us on LinkedIn for updates across our organization, show highlights, and more. You can find us by searching for Security Weekly Productions. All right, for our second interview today, we have Isabelle Roccia with us today to talk about privacy in Europe and why it matters. Isabelle is Managing Director Europe at the International Association of Privacy Professionals. It's her job to engage with industry leaders, policymakers, government, and the general public on the topic of privacy. And she has a long career developing policy and negotiating policy issues across Europe and with the U.S. Welcome to the show, Isabelle.
Thank you, Adrian. Hi, very nice to be here.
Nice to have you here. So I think the reason that we went out, I still don't know exactly how we managed to find you, how we got connected, but we certainly reported a few months ago, I think it was back in December, when it was announced that after 2 years of negotiation, Germany's, I forget the name of the organization, the DSK, failed to, negotiations failed, and basically Microsoft 365, which is one of the world's largest, business suites, couldn't be used legally in Germany under the GDPR. So, I thought, man, it would be great if we could get somebody from Europe, that could kind of explain to us what happened there. But I think before we dig into that, I'd like to understand the IAPP's mission and what you do there a little bit better.
Yeah, sure. Happy to give you a bit of an intro about who we are. So as you said, the IAPP is the International Association of Privacy Professionals. So we're the world's largest information privacy organization. So we are policy neutral. We're not a lobby group, but our mission is really to help build and promote the privacy profession across the globe. And what we mean by privacy profession is really should be privacy professions, because there's a lot of different function in any organization really that we see important and really integral to privacy and data protection. So we have about close to 80,000 members across the world in about 150 countries. So we have a pretty wide remit. And so what we do, we help those professionals keep up with developments on policy, on technology, on regulation that are impacting the way they should deliver their mission every day. And so we do that in a few different ways. What we're best known for is our conferences. So we do run events that are really top-notch in the profession around different countries. So we have one in Brussels where I sit every year. We have our Global Privacy Summit that's going to be in Washington early April, and so that's really our flagship event. If you have to attend a privacy conference this year, I really recommend this one, because it's really the place to be if you want to know about what's impacting the privacy profession and why you should care what matters. But we do have conferences in a lot of other countries in Europe and outside. And so that's for our events. We also do a lot of reporting, again, on news developments. We have a research department that helps us go a bit more into detail into issues of the days, on AI governance, on synthetic data, on what have you. And then another piece of what we do is really about, again, helping build a profession. We have training and certification programs that we run to, again, help bring more skilled professionals into this profession, because much like in the security area, we need people, and we need more people than we currently have on the marketplace, and that talent shortage is a big issue. So that's more or less who we are. So I run the Europe office, but we have global operations with our headquarters in Portsmouth, New Hampshire.
Oh, interesting. I did not know that. I'm sorry, I might have missed it when you were talking, but did you mention where the events typically are? Are they all over Europe, or is the one big one that's always in one particular place every year?
Right. So we do have a few. So our main event is the Washington DC event early April. It's the Global Privacy Summit. We have a European Congress, which runs also annually in Brussels, Belgium. That's in November. And then we have other events I may miss one on the list, but we have Canada, Singapore, Australia, and then UK, Germany, France, the Netherlands. I may have forgotten one, and I apologize if I did, but that gives you a sense of who we are.
Some event managers angry at you right now.
Probably. I hope not. But we do also have, so one big thing with the IAPP is the community of members. As I said, we have like 80,000 over the world, and we do also do a lot of local events. So a bit of trivia: we have the Data Privacy Day coming soon. It's at the end of January, and so around that date, on the 26th, we're going to do a lot of events. So wherever you are, there's probably an IAPP chapter close or where you are. So if you want to connect with those folks, that's on the IAPP website. You can find the info, and that's a good way to also meet people who are in the profession and are just interested in the same issues and looking for advice and solution and connection. So there's a very vibrant privacy community out there.
Yeah, it's a fascinating topic, because I'm, part of my career and my personal life, my personal brand are all intertwined. So for me, privacy is this very kind of vague, kind of nebulous thing. I mean, there are obviously things about me, personal information, social security number, that 100%, I want protected. But there's certain aspects of my life, like my hobbies and things like that, like I want to share somewhat. And I do have some friends that are the complete opposite. They don't have any social media. They're just starting to have kids, and they're very concerned about the amount of privacy kids are going to have, their kids in particular are going to have growing up, and much more reticent, much more reluctant to engage in a lot of the technology and the new gadgets and things like that come out. So, I think that's part of what I wanted to cover today is to understand more from a European perspective, like the general attitudes on this. Like, I imagine there is a range of attitudes towards it, but where it affects policy, I imagine, I mean, clearly you guys are ahead of us on this. I think Brazil has a version of GDPR, LGPD, I think it might be. And California's just now getting there. It typically, is the front runner in the U.S. for this sort of legislation. But yeah, maybe you could just give me a general sense of, how privacy is thought of there, and I guess the intersection between, because a lot of it is personal information, right? But it's information that that you use at work, which I don't know. Does that make it more complicated, or is that seen as a less complex issue in Europe?
So yeah, there's a lot to unpack there. I think there's a couple of things that are really important to understand if you want to sort of appreciate the approach that Europe is taking. One is that in Europe, and when I say Europe, I mean the European Union, the institutions around the EU. So that's 27 countries basically coming together in Brussels at the EU level to develop their laws and regulations, and that's where the EU privacy legislation originated. But before that, I think privacy is a fundamental right in Europe, and that has a lot of bearing on how the policies are developed, how they're implemented, what is the expectations of regulators, how does the court look at privacy legislation and how it should be implemented. So the fundamental right aspect has been a huge driver since the inception of the EU General Data Protection Regulation, the GDPR, which is, as you said, now being replicated in a lot of other countries. So that's number one. I think that the second aspect is, and you touched on it, the cultural aspect and the historical dimension of privacy in Europe. I mean, there's a lot attached to that still to this day. In not so distant European history, I mean, there were some pretty dramatic stories of state police spying on their citizens and things like that. And so that's really informed as well I think the collective on how we should think about privacy. And with that, I should nuance my own statement there, because there's not a unified way to look at privacy in Europe. There are some nuances, and depending on which country you're in, depending on whether you're looking at it from a purely professional standpoint or from, as you said, sort of from more of a personal standpoint. But that's so. I think those two elements are quite important. And then I think one of the reasons why Europe is so key when you look at privacy development across the world is that Europe has been a first adopter of the first modern comprehensive privacy legislation. That's the GDPR. That was in 2016. It's been actively being implemented since 2018, so it's been a few years. But with that first adopter, the GDPR has been replicated, or at least has inspired a lot of other countries to look at a similar sort of comprehensive law and using the same model of law. So the EU has really been an influencer at the global level on what privacy legislation should look like. It's not always exactly the same elsewhere because of a lot of different reasons, but certainly the inspiration has been there. And I think it does give the EU, or rather the EU is really good at being the first mover, like at having the first mover's advantage. And that's something that we've seen with privacy and that we see in other areas of law around sort of digital data policy. For a few years now, the EU has been developing legislation on artificial intelligence, on how to regulate platforms, on online advertising, on all those issues that are really key to today's economy, key to businesses. And the EU is oftentimes a lot more advanced in developing those policies than any other country, US included. And so that also informs a lot of the dynamics there, because when Brussels decides it's going to legislate on something, it will legislate. That there's a proposal always leads to a legislation. So that's also why people look at Brussels, because they know that when Brussels starts to talk about an AI act, an AI legislation, like we know that may take a few years, but we will see a piece of legislation. So that's why it draws so much attention as well in Brussels. I did want to pick up on something that you mentioned as well on the personal data aspect. One thing that is sometimes challenging with the way Brussels looks at those issues is also precisely that delineation between what is personal data and what isn't. And we've seen now with sort of 4 years of the application of the GDPR that the boundaries between personal data and non-personal data is not always clear. And so that has led to a lot of implementation challenges about the GDPR, but also about the entire legislative landscape that's developing around it. And maybe on your point about how do Europeans look at privacy, I think you're going to have a lot of different views, again, depending on who you ask. We tend to characterize it here as Europeans care more about privacy than any other care more about privacy than Americans or other countries. I'm not sure that that's true. I haven't seen any solid methodology that would show that it's true. I think we all have sort of a different understanding of what we're talking about, and I think mostly it's also about a different understanding of the risk and a different approach to the risk. We may have the same understanding, but decide to have a different level of acceptance of the risk as well. So it's all very indeed very personal thing. But the challenge is for Europe, but as much as for other countries, is then to define rules that make sense for all of that. And so that's why privacy is super fascinating. It's also super complex, and there's never a dull moment in the privacy world at the moment.
Yeah, I can imagine. It's constantly in the news. It's a constant topic of conversation. It affects culture. It affects, like, especially when you're in the security industry. Like, you can't just take a selfie with someone. Like the odds of somebody being a little bit more privacy conscious within the security community, it tends to be a little bit higher, and in the general population, I think it's higher than it ever has been as well. But I wonder how much of the dynamics there are because a lot of the social media companies are based in the U.S. and how much of that is maybe preferential treatment of those companies, and the amount of lobbying and stuff like that. I'm sure that could be a whole different interview in conversation. You may have some opinions there. I don't know if you're comfortable sharing them, but I think Katie had some questions. Katie?
I do. Sorry, my mouse isn't up to speed today. I find this really fascinating. And Isabelle, you even mentioned that within the 27 member states, there are some nuances between countries. And that's really interesting to me. How are these laws getting made when you have all that input? Because you've got several countries that are really bullish on privacy laws. They're much more strict than others. But how do you come together with something that is an overriding policy or an overriding law when you have these differences of opinions for such a big geographic area and cultures?
That's a great question, and it goes really to the complexity of what then privacy professionals and security professionals to some extent have to implement. So without going into the details of the sausage making in Brussels, it's all about compromise. The 27 member states are going to sit around the table and look at the proposal that's coming from the European Commission, which is the executive branch, so to speak. The same thing will be done at the European Parliament, which is the house that represents European citizens, and then everybody's going to sit at the table and try to find consensus to achieve a one text. That's overly simplified, but that's the dynamic in broad brush. What's challenging with that, and it's not specific to privacy, I think we see that in Europe on a number of issues, is that first of all, getting consensus among 27 countries is, regardless of what it is you're discussing, it's going to be challenging, right? If you ask a bunch of Europeans the type of coffee they like, you're going to have 27 different versions, from espresso to latte to cappuccino to American. Like, it's just going to be hard to build consensus. So what this leads to oftentimes, and I think we started seeing that with GDPR, in fact, is that at the EU level, with all of those people around the table, they're going to say, okay, we agree to disagree in a way. We agree that this particular issue we're not going to resolve around this table. So we're going to leave it to other people to decide and specify. So what end up happening sometimes is a text, and I'll take a GDPR example, the age for children, like above what age can children consent, and what is the threshold for obtaining parental consent? What's the age for children? Negotiations during the GDPR it was not possible to reach a consensus on an actual age. Some countries wanted 13-year-old, others wanted 14, 15, etc. So what we ended up seeing in the GDPR is essentially, look, your country, you're going to have to decide the age that you want for your own market, but we'll agree at European level that it cannot be below 13. So as a result, we know that no country will go below 13, but then some countries may require 16 years, others 15. So we do see a patchwork of legislation. So the GDPR, for example, that was supposed to be harmonizing privacy rules across Europe. And to be fair, it does on a lot of different things, but there are some aspects that are just creating this fragmentation still across Europe. And so that's from on the legislation in the text, that's what it is, but it creates implementation complexities for people who are then like privacy professionals in the IAPP or others that are really trying to figure out what does it mean in practice? What is it that I'm expected to do? How can I achieve that? What are the policy practices that I need to put in place to actually meet those requirements? And that's just one example. And the more, I think, as Brussels look at increasingly complex issues, like AI being the obvious example, the risk is that because it's so difficult to build consensus, we may see legislation that's vague or has some internal friction or conflicts between provisions within one text or provisions that conflict between, for example, the AI Act and the GDPR. So we may see a trend in which what comes out of Brussels is, again, vague or just leaves room for interpretation, but is then specified in other mechanisms that are maybe not as easy to understand, maybe not as transparent. And so that feeds an inherent complexity in the system that, again, for professionals, it makes things a lot more complicated to navigate. And one of the issues that we see in the privacy profession, and I imagine that might be the same for security professionals out there, is that you actually need bodies to do the work. You need resources. And so if the picture that you have to meet is more and more complex, then that probably means that you need more resources and more skills. And so that is also creating a lot of ripple effect into the actual implementation world of those roles. And one last point I'll add to the complexity is that, again, looking at privacy, the GDPR is one text, is the main piece of legislation in Europe. You have those other sort of instruments at national level that are going to specify a few elements here and there. But beyond that, you also have the data protection authorities that are in each of the member states, the agencies in charge of interpreting and enforcing the regulation. They regularly publish guidelines on how we should interpret certain aspects of the text. So that add an additional layer of information and documentation that professionals need to analyze and digest. There's also the jurisprudence from the courts that adds another layer of complexity. So it's not just about reading the GDPR, it's really about understanding everything that surrounds it as well. And again, that leads to a very complex and frankly ever-evolving book of rules for professionals. So that really is I think the complexity of it all is really the one key challenge that we see.
Thank you.
Sorry, that was not really uplifting.
No, that was a great answer. My follow-up question is really about, so GDPR has really been this leading legislation. And I think, at least in the US, a lot of companies struggled when they had to comply with it. They struggled to implement it. And now a few years on, they understand what it is, but we still haven't adopted anything over here that's nearly as comprehensive. We have a few states that come close, but there is no federal law. There is a proposal. I personally am skeptical as to whether or not that's going to get passed. I think it's probably going to get watered down, while some states in the US are trying to block it because they want it more stringent. But why do you think other countries, other geographies, other cultures are so reticent to to implement something more GDPR-like?
So I'm not sure I would say many are reticent. I think we've seen since the GDPR, and not suggesting the GDPR is the thing that made it all happen, but it certainly was a great impetus for that. Over the past few years, we've seen dozens and dozens of jurisdictions coming up with their own rules. Canada is updating theirs, Indonesia, Brazil, Adrian mentioned, India is looking at a law as well. Indonesia, I think I mentioned, Australia. So, I mean, there's over 100 countries today have a privacy legislation on the books. That's pretty significant. Now, to your point, indeed, what we see in the US is it's certainly interesting. I think in the profession, there's a lot of hope that at some point there will be a federal legislation. I think regardless of where we would want it to land, I mean, as IAPP, we don't have a position on that. I'm sure many of our members do. But I think what it goes to show is as many states develop their own legislation, I think it creates even more of that impetus to have a federal legislation to at least have this harmonized approach across the country. And I think that's also part of what was seen as one of the key benefits of the GDPR for Europe, is that it made trade and business among member states to some extent easier. It also made consumer more confident that it could go online to buy something from a different country, because there was this assumption that their personal data would be protected. Me sitting in Belgium, I could buy something in Sweden and know that my personal data would be protected. So there's I think an economic benefit in having this kind of legislation. Now, as I say that, I know that a lot of people listening are going to think, well, I mean, there's still a pretty hefty compliance cost to actually building privacy solutions and privacy programs. And I'm absolutely not disputing that. And we've seen some of that friction, certainly, as you mentioned, about there is so many rules to comply with, and again, their inherent complexity makes it difficult. But we do see that trend of countries committing more and more to having a privacy legislation on the books. I think the other element that is also helping that trend is, I'm going to state two obvious things. One is we live in digital society, so everything happens online. That's a good impetus. The other impetus is that because we live online, we live in a borderless world. And if you want to trade with big trading partners like Europe, you have to meet their standards if you want to transfer personal data. And so that has also been a good incentive to have equivalence of rules meeting GDPR standards. And so that has also, I think, been an incentive indeed to have more legislation. And I think we do see again there's a few very significant markets like India, for instance, and Indonesia and Brazil that are really, I mean, we're talking about billions of people now being covered by privacy legislation. So I think this movement is probably here to stay. And again, that's really just the first layer. If we see Brussels as an inspiration, so to speak, on some of this, we know that more legislation is going to come around data governance issues and digital issues more broadly.
So I wanted to, I mentioned Germany's decision, the DSK's position on Microsoft 365 earlier, which is kind of the reverse of some of what you were describing earlier. You were talking about the need to compromise, and get the 27 members, to all agree on something that everyone can live with. But what happens when one of those 27, like what happened with Germany in November, says, we feel like in Microsoft 365, I mean, there's really, maybe this is a US-centric mindset, but it really seems like there's only two players in that space. If you want email files, calendar, pretty much everything you need to launch a business in one package. It's either Google or Microsoft. So for Germany to say, yeah, we don't think under the GDPR it's legal to use this, does that immediately have ramifications for all 26 other countries, or how does that fall out? How does that work?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the DSK is in Germany, the 18, I want to say, regulators are in Germany. Each country then has their own regulators. The data protection authorities, the DPAs, have independence. That's a very cherished status that they have. So in theory, each DPA is able to take a decision that concerns its own market. Now, with the GDPR, what it brought was this idea that because the EU is one single market, data protection authorities need to interpret and align their interpretation and their enforcement actions at European level. Otherwise, if you have a legislation but it's interpreted differently in Germany than in Spain, than in Sweden, than in Greece, it doesn't do much good. So we're in a phase where it's a bit it's not crystal clear where those things are. And the reason I'm saying that is that just this week, in fact, there was another major decision given by the Irish Data Protection Commissioner this time. It was, in fact, two decisions on Meta, one decision on Facebook and one on Instagram. And that decision, so the merit of it, like the substance of it, is actually quite interesting, and it's not unlike the Microsoft 365 case that you mentioned. But what's interesting is that it also reveals the consensus is maybe not the right word, but the difference of opinions and analysis of the GDPR in some of those cases. Because we've seen with those decisions a difference of opinion between the Irish regulator and the European Data Protection Board, which is the group of European data protection authorities at EU level. Under this umbrella of the EDPB, they're supposed to come to common decisions, common interpretation, guidelines, and such. And we see in that case was a good illustration of it, that there are still differences of opinion. And so what does it mean? It means that we can still see differences of interpretation and differences of way to enforce the regulation in the different countries. So that creates, again, another layer of uncertainty for companies. What the 365 case brings, though, is there's a lot in that decision, but I think it goes to a few points that are really, really important. And one of them is on data transfers. I think that's really one of the key issues. And we do hear privacy professionals telling us that complying with data transfer rules is probably the number one compliance issue that they see. And that's consistently year after year. Like, that's really where a lot of the compliance challenges sit. And other aspects of the Microsoft 365 decisions was really around when does Microsoft act as a controller, when does it act as a processor? So that's also a concept that's still not always clear cut in its interpretation, and that's already at a very simplified level. And then another aspect was really around transparency and the legal basis that Microsoft was using. And again, the case that I mentioned about Meta this week was also a little bit around, in part around this transparency and legal basis issues. So, and you guys alluded to that earlier as well. There's oftentimes the big news that we see out of Europe on GDPR enforcement are on social media or companies like Microsoft and such. I think so those are relayed by the media. There are a lot of other enforcement actions that take place that are not necessarily focused on social media or IT companies. But it's true that the heftiest fine that we've seen so far were on those cases. I think there's a lot more to enforcement than just the level of fines. And what we often impress upon when we look at those decisions is the fines are huge. It's not even necessarily the main point. the point with those decisions from DPAs is that you're going to have to pay the fine, sure, but mostly you're going to have to adjust the way you've been carrying your business. You're going to have to adjust your privacy practices, and that's really where it can be very significant for industry to have some of those decisions. Having to change your legal basis means that you have to change a lot of a lot of processing operations that you're doing, a lot of the contracting that you've been doing. So there's potentially a lot of ramifications for a lot of companies in those decisions. I think that's where those decisions are really, really significant.
Yeah, it's interesting. And we just recently saw Dropbox pick up Boxcryptor, which was a German specific secure file sharing company. So it was interesting to see that get kind of pulled together into Dropbox. But yeah, I wanted to give some of my co-hosts some time for some more questions. Sean, do you want to go next?
Absolutely. Thank you. Interesting discussion. I appreciate you being on, Isabelle. What are some of the things that people should be most aware of when it comes to being safe from a privacy perspective? And I have a second question, which is related. I have kids, so what is something that a preteen or teenager should be most aware of when it comes to online privacy?
Okay, great questions. I think so. There's more and more emphasis in Europe around kids' privacy. I think it's something that we see in the US as well. I mean, the most basic thing is probably going to be about being aware of what being online actually means from a personal data perspective. Scrolling through a social media platform, hitting the like button, things like that. Like these are perhaps meaningless or very mundane activities, but there's a processing aspect behind it. And without going into the complexity of that with a kid, having to explain all of the mechanisms of that, I think impressing upon them that anything that you do online can be traced, recorded, used. This is something I think that is quite important. So building the awareness. Then again, as I said earlier, I think it's up to each individual to decide the level of risks that they're willing to take online. There's a legislative frame that's going to protect them on a number of different fronts, but ultimately there's a lot of a choice from the individual into the conduct that they take. And I'm sorry, Sean, I forgot the first question that you asked. I'm sorry.
Oh, no worries. I bundled them together in the interest of time. But the first one was, what are some things that people should be most aware of when it comes to being safe from a privacy perspective online?
Right. Okay.
Which I think you kind of were talking to.
Yes, I guess that I would say a little bit of a few of the same points. I think building your own awareness on what are the I guess the security trends, understanding again how malicious actors can actually use your data. Like I'm drawing a little bit from the security world there because I think there's a lot of similarities in how we see some of those things. But then I guess in the privacy, it depends if you're looking at it from a purely sort of in the personal area or in the commercial area. The situations may be vastly different. But again, I come back to this awareness issue, and we translate that often in the IAPP into building awareness of professionals as well, and of regulators, frankly. I mean, understanding how technology works, understanding how it evolves, understanding how business models can evolve as well. I mean, all of that this is really moving targets, and I think that's really the challenge in understanding how to be safe online, is that this is not a point A to point B journey. It is very much something that is evolutive, and just being able to keep up with the how technology evolves, how risks evolve, is really a key challenge. I don't have a great answer for you other than keep raising awareness there and going after the information so that you yourself are equipped to at least have the reflexes of wondering whether clicking on that link is a good thing or not.
Yeah, thank you for that. I had a discussion with my kids recently and actually did a tweet on Saturday night about seeing how visible things are. And after about 24 hours, 185,000 people had viewed it, and about 1,000 people had responded, because my request was, hey, if you see this, just let us know where in the world you are. And about 1,000 people had responded from 318 cities in 94 countries. So just in a day, a lot of people had seen it, trying to show my child what sort of the impact is when you post something. Obviously, Twitter's a little more public, but still that can relate to others as well. So yeah, I appreciate your insight. It's very helpful.
Yeah, and I think to wrap things up here, Katie, you had a great question for Isabelle.
Yeah, obviously, you're the International Association of Privacy Professionals, and privacy has really taken off, thankfully, in the last few years. And so it's a profession that is a little bit newer in some senses. We're obviously going to need more privacy professionals as more countries adopt more laws and as things get more complicated. What kinds of people are going into the privacy field? How do people get there? What kind of backgrounds do they have? Is there a particular path that makes more sense than others? What are you seeing, and what would your advice be for anybody who might be interested in pursuing a career in privacy?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think I mentioned earlier the challenge that we see in having enough people in the workplace to actually feel the need for privacy professionals, and much like in the security world, we don't have enough people. And so encouraging people to get into the profession, training them, and making sure that they maintain the right skill set is absolutely critical. I think we've done some quantification, so it was very empirical. It's not necessarily super scientific methodology, but we've used that some of the numbers triggered, for example, by the implementation of the GDPR. The GDPR has led in Europe alone to the registration of 500,000 data protection officers. So that's the one function that's mandatory in Europe. So 500,000 already just on the basis of GDPR for Europe alone. If you look at markets like the US, like Indonesia, that are absolutely significant, you're going to have numbers in magnitude of 100,000s as well. We've seen some comparison with cybersecurity as well, and all the indicators are that within 5 to 10 years, we're going to need 1.5 to 2 million privacy professionals globally. So that's a very significant challenge to actually bring that many professionals to the profession, but making sure that they actually have the expertise built to actually take up the challenge there. So that's a very, very real concern and a challenge for the profession. In terms of the profiles that we see and that the profession needs, I think, again, much like in the security world, that we need a lot of variety of profiles. Naturally, in privacy, we have a lot of lawyers, but we also have engineers, we have IT professionals. It is the case in many organizations that you're going to have one guy wearing a lot of different hats, and one of those hats is going to be a privacy hat. But I think having different skill set is also what can enrich the privacy approach that a company is going to take. Having an experience in security certainly is a plus, because I think the synergies between the privacy and security world are really massive and should be leveraged a lot more where there's that sweet spot of data protection from privacy and security standpoint. They're not always intertwined. We can have security without privacy, and privacy without security. Like, the two are not always linked. But where there is that sweet spot, I think there's a lot that the two professions can do. And so one of the things that we're doing, I mentioned our training and certification program earlier. That's our ISO certified. That's a good way to sort of build your skill set and validate them in the marketplace. There's also a lot to be done with higher education to encourage students to get in the profession. And there as well, it's about law schools, it's about business schools, about engineering. We need a lot of different profiles. So the IAPP invests a lot in creating the incentives and building the profession as well, not just for professionals who are there already today, but really ensure that there's a pipeline of younger professionals coming to this afterwards, because we're gonna desperately need people. So there's job security in there for sure.
Wow, thanks for that, Isabelle. So many eloquent and comprehensive answers to all the questions that we had today, and I think this is the most questions I've ever seen me and my co-host fire at a guest in one interview. So thank you so much for answering all our questions.
Well, I appreciate it. It was fun, and I'm glad it was insightful, and this was really, really pleasant. So thank you for having me, and thank you for the question.
Yeah, you're doing good work. Thank you for lending us some of your time in the evening. I forget what time it is over there, but I'm sure it's fairly late in the evening. But yeah, thank you for coming on. We'd love to have you on again sometime if you'd be okay with that.
I would love that. Thank you so much.
All right, we'll be back in just a few moments with the weekly enterprise news.
managing and protecting the world's grueling number of endpoints, enabling Tanium's customers to see, control, and protect every endpoint everywhere. Tanium's mission is to provide certainty in uncertain times with the industry's only converged endpoint management. Trusted by the U.S. military and the majority of the Fortune 100, Tanium helps manage and protect nearly 30 million endpoints. Tanium, the power of certainty. Visit securityweekly.com/Tanium to learn more.
Welcome back to Enterprise Security Weekly. Do you have a specific guest or topic that you want us to cover in one of the shows? Submit your suggestions for guests by visiting securityweekly.com/guests and completing the form. We review suggestions monthly and will reach out to you once reviewed. All right, now for the Enterprise Security Weekly news. It sounded like somebody might have fallen out of their chair. I hope you're okay.
Wasn't me, I swear. I promise it wasn't me.
It was me putting my cat down. He was right in front of the camera. Yeah.
It was the cat in the parlor with the wrench.
Yeah.
Oh, it will be if I don't get up and feed him soon.
Yeah, he does love the camera. He does. Just trying to get some time on the camera. Trying to get his 15 minutes. All right. So you can check out securityweekly.com/ESW302 if you want to follow along. Check out the notes. As usual, we may not get to all the stories, but I managed to pare it down a little bit more this week. We don't have a crazy amount like we did last week. Funding. Pretty quiet with funding, and both the items in funding were somewhat surprising to me. I remember when Netskope raised their Series G, they're like, yeah, we're not really hurting for money. We're just taking this, to add to the war chest, so we have some extra cash, but we're not in a hurry to IPO. We're doing okay. And that was 4 rounds of funding ago. And of course, these are all like Tyler, I don't understand these rounds of funding when it's post VC, but pre-IPO, or, it gets into some terminology I'm not familiar with.
Yeah, Adrian, it largely depends on the structure. And sometimes there's no transparency in that structure with regards to a public release right there. And I haven't dug into the last handful of rounds, but
it's a convertible note. This one is a convertible note,
which likely means it's a bit of a convertible debt model, which means that it's a payback of it's a fund where they can pay it back as debt with interest, right? Based off of what they're making on a annual basis in revenue, they pay off the interest and pay off the loan over time, right? If an acquisition occurs, that convertible debt note will convert into an equity stake in the business. Is basically the 300,000 foot view version of what a convertible note is. But yeah, it's tough to know once you get into these big, large money rounds. Like parts of them are secondaries, parts of them are convertible notes, parts of them could be traditional venture, parts of them could be driving toward a majority ownership stake, like a true PE purchase that happens over, say, 2 or 3 tranches over time. There's lots of different ways to structure these deals. So, when you get into the point where this round was $400 million, the last round was $300 million, and the round before that was $300 million. That's just massive amounts of money, right? And I think parts of that is original early stakeholders selling off their stakes to secondary buyers. I think parts of that is, just investment, natural primary investment. There's all different ways you can structure it. So, yeah, it's tough to know, to be honest with you, but this one looks like it's a convertible note that is a debt-based instrument that will convert to equity in the event of an IPO.
Yeah, I'm looking up so it's a total of $1.4 billion that they've raised, and I'm looking for the valuation. But yeah, I mean, you can't directly compare those two. If some of that $1.4 billion is just equity changing hands, right?
Yeah, that's exactly the problem. And then some of it is debt, which will be paid back and may or may not ever convert into an equity stake. So, it's not always apples to apples straightforward when you talk about a total funding amount over the course of through G, and whatever is after G. I can't even do my alphabet.
Yeah, H.
H,
yeah.
I.
It's funny. They did a venture round. And I wonder if they're just trying to avoid calling it a Series H. Just is it embarrassing at that point to call it that? But yeah, their valuation is 7.5 billion. But I do get that. I get that sense like nobody wants to. Like everybody's, it seems like everybody's using these alternative fundraising methods to avoid visibly having a down round or visibly, raising a ridiculous, like HIJK,
Mm-hmm.
Is there any historical data on when it just becomes untenable? Because when you start talking about these numbers, okay, on paper, maybe your valuation is whatever you said, 7-point-something billion. But in the real world, if you're not getting sold, if you're not going IPO, if you are paying back debt, there has to be some balance. All of this is fictional, right? Really.
It could be all happens. I mean, with them being private, it could be all really well balanced. Like we don't know what the revenue is. We don't know what, any of the numbers in there, or, what's being done with this money. So, and it's normal for large corporations to take on debt and to pay off debt and to go through cycles like that. Right. So it's just really hard to tell when all the financials are private.
It's a natural tool in they call it leverage. It's a natural tool in the general concept of a business to lever up with debt, right? And we saw it, in the 80s and 90s quite a bit, in the 80s and late 80s, early 90s, with acquisitions, kind of that corporate raider mentality, come in, buy the company, lever it up, get a bigger valuation based on the leverage, and then resell it off, right? And so it's not uncommon to take on debt. And actually, most cybersecurity companies have at least some form of revolving debt that they run regardless of a convertible note debt model like this is.
Sure. And I think it's not even uncommon outside of the cybersecurity world. There's a huge lending community out there that loves debt, right? But from a business owner point of view, is there some sort of formula based on historical data where you can say, whoa, this is too much, we're going to get into deep water here that we're never going to be able to tread? Or is it just...
It's a tough equation. So we did have to, in business school, do these types of equations. I don't remember the math off the top of my head, but there is a point at which you can't service your debts anymore. And that is the traditional concept of a zombie company, is a company who's taken on enough debt that they can't service their own debts, and they're just on that long walk to death of slowly bleeding themselves out because they can't outpace their debt payments, right? That's what a traditional zombie is. So yeah, you can get yourself in trouble with too much debt, just like a human being can get in trouble with too much debt. If I take out too much debt on my credit card and I can't pay that revolving credit on a monthly basis, it starts to build up and compound, and it can get you in a lot of trouble. Businesses are no different. And, leverage gives you the opportunity to make money with money, right? That's why you lever up. You lever up to have free cash flow to then reinvest in the business or to reinvest in some kind of stock or equity, which will return a rate higher than the interest rate that you're paying on the debt, right? And that's the concept of leverage. And so, yeah, if you mislever, you lever too far, you lever at a rate that doesn't make sense against your return, you can absolutely get yourself in trouble.
And Tyler, aren't there companies or say founders that have levered up, so to speak, run up debt with one company and sold or bankrupted it, moved on, started up another one, kind of ran the same scheme?
I'm sure there are. I'm sure there's tons of them that have. That you're starting to get into like the risk reward of being a creditor, right? Of actually running lines of credit for companies. You have to understand the risk reward of that, the chance of getting paid back, all of that stuff. And there's all sorts of bond ratings, debt ratings for those types of to hopefully limit those types of activities.
Yeah, so let's lever on to story number 2. So I was really not expecting Hack the Box to come out with a really healthy size Series B, but it was really, really interesting seeing this pop up. I mean, obviously training, we just got done talking to Isabelle about the number of privacy jobs that are going to be out there, talking globally, millions of privacy jobs. And it's the same for InfoSec. There's tons of jobs out there. Maybe not as many as some people try and say, but it's a topic for a different time. But I found this really interesting because Hack the Box, if you just tweet out or toot out, if you're on Mastodon, what's your favorite training? Like, where are you going to point somebody that's trying to get into the industry, trying to skill up? A lot of people are going to say Hack the Box. It's going to come right off the top of their head. And Hack the Box kind of made a name for themselves. I just fixed the link, Tyler. I forgot to.
That was supposed to be a back channel that you could answer later, but that didn't work.
Yeah, like I could pretend like everything runs smoothly here, but sometimes links are broken in the show notes, and I fixed them live, as I just did with that one. But yeah, it's an interesting model because usually when you think security training, the first name that comes up is SANS Institute. And one of the things that comes up with SANS is, like that's a common perk of a job. Like, are they going to send you to SANS? Because it can cost $6,000 for the travel and just for the course to go to like a 6-day SANS course. You get a lot of value out of it, but still $6,000. Like somebody starting out in the industry typically doesn't have $6,000 to go off to a SANS course. And SANS does have some other options. But this is really where Hack the Box kind of shines. Like the most money you can spend at Hack the Box is $20 a month. And they've done this amazing job at just making it super easy to jump on their platform and to learn stuff and to take all that training and kind of deliver it, almost a consumerization of like a SANS model where you get instead of the teacher in front of the room, it's just all the exercises you could want. You have your own virtual machines, at that top $20 tier that you can reboot and mess with to your heart's content. And it seems like they did a really good job of, building a more consumer level subscription product, than SANS's kind of monolithic, go to a 6-day course and get a certification product.
Yeah, what's really interesting in this one is the 1.7 million users. Because you didn't fix the link actually properly on the website, I'm not sure if that's daily average users, monthly average users, what it is. And that was a subtle dig at you, Adrian. But
it's fixed.
That being said, 1.7 million users is a lot of users. I'd be interested in knowing what that growth rate is and what the
how many are
the average ARR or MRR per user works out to be, because you're right, it's a consumerization of cybersecurity training, which is absolutely fantastic. They've moved way down market, and what can they do to grow it from here? I mean, I see why they might have got a reasonably large B round to really grow this kind of B2C play.
Yeah, it's a huge community, and if you've used the tool recently, it is like it used to be slick. It's really slick now.
Yeah, and the key to it is having that environment that you can interact with, that you can play around with, that you can actually do the exercises. It's more difficult to have your own lab and then run through using tools and practice an attack against an environment. And the way that these simulations are set up are fairly realistic. They're not always the same. Tyler Robinson and I did a Twitch stream about a year or so ago where he was going through the attacking the environment on a Hack the Box type environment. And we did it for several hours, and I was providing background ideas around Active Directory and other things that he was working on and trying to do. And it was very interesting because certainly from someone who has a real world experience attacking Fortune 100 companies, going against a simulated environment, there are some things that are different, but it's really built around people learning and understanding what's going on and what to look for in the environment. Where are these flags? What are certain things that you can find in the environment? And how can that be interesting from an attacker perspective? I think it's a great way for people to understand it because there are a lot of folks that can read things, but really when they get the experience to try it out and test it out, that's when it really connects for people.
I mean, it's literally a portal into the industry. one of the products they have on their site is they have a job portal. So this is something people are putting on their resumes, their accomplishments on Hack the Box. And it's, it's giving them a path into the industry, which is something the industry needs. So it's kind of cool to see them kind of to turn that into this, especially for people, that find it challenging to find $6,000 and get to Virginia Beach or, Atlanta or wherever you're taking, Phoenix, wherever you're taking your SANS course.
Oh, and $6,000 is the start of it. I mean, as you said, it's like $6,000 for the course, potentially more, plus hotel, plus travel. Yeah. I went to a SANS course years ago when it was much cheaper, and it was the Swan and Dolphin in Florida, which was fantastic. Thankfully, my company paid for it. But yeah, if you're starting in the industry, same. That's just not going to happen.
Yeah, same. That's the only way I've ever made it to a SANS course is when the company's paying for it. And too often, I worked for a company that wouldn't pay for it. I love the training I got. It's just not as accessible as this, and it's not going to, with that model, you're not going to be able to train up as many people as with the Hack the Box one. I think they both have their place. It very much is a perk, I think, for employees because it's kind of like a mini vacation. Like a lot of the SANS events are in places that are nice to visit. And you get to network and meet in person with other people. So they both have their place. It's, I'm not trying to punch down on SANS Institute in any way. It's just, I think Hack the Box really filled a niche that needed filling.
Yeah, and you can do it from the comfort of your own home as well, which relates directly to what people have been looking for, a virtual environment, not just a virtual training, but something they can do on their own time, at their own pace, and have an environment where they can mess around, they can break stuff and reset it. And it's not that expensive either, which I think is why systems like this, services like this can become very popular, certainly in the 1+ million range.
Yep. And I bet they killed it in the pandemic. I bet they absolutely killed it in the pandemic.
Yeah.
Oh, for sure.
Yeah, I don't know how much SANS had to cancel events, but go ahead, Katie.
Yeah, I was going to say, like one of you said, it definitely feels a niche, but I wouldn't worry about the SANS and other in-person training companies because there are people who do like the in-person events. There are people who learn better in an in-person environment. So I think this is great, especially for those who either won't or can't get sponsored by their company or at least, some sort of support, or who can't or won't travel for whatever reason. But I think there's a good place for both types of learning. And it really depends on who you are and how you learn, because no two people learn the same way.
And it ranges from free forever to $20 a month. So yeah, it's pretty nice.
You can't beat the cost, but I do think that a lot of these in-person trainings will continue to survive for other reasons that may not be fulfilled for those people personally.
So just doing some math, if it's similar to other consumer models that have freemium models, a conservative number would be 51,000 paying members out of that 1.7 million.
If 51,000 at like $10 a month, that's great revenue.
Yeah, and that's at I'm just like pulling from Dropbox from those kinds of companies from the numbers I recall seeing them have. Yeah. Cool. All right. Let's see. So IronNet. IronNet is standing at 30 cents a share on the New York Stock Exchange and has been notified that they're in breach of the requirements. They're not in compliance with the listing requirements. So I don't know what happened here. But I don't know if any of you guys have any insight into this, but this was NSA director, ex-NSA director Keith Alexander is the CEO, and they went public via SPAC last year. And we talked a lot about how, the downsides of SPACs and stuff like that. And it seems to be a mix of things. like the running of the company, the products they chose, whether or not they have product fit. It seems like it's like an NDR product, a network detection and response type product, but they have a lot of services as well. So even from the website, I'm not super clear on what they're selling and what the value prop is.
The kick in that article, if you read it, it says that IronNet lost $77.7 million across the first 9 months of 2022. That was after it went public in 2021. They lost almost $80 million in the first 3 quarters of 2022. Had to cut its staff by 35% in September. And, they just never really truly had product market fit, had raised a ton of money, and were just burning cash, didn't know how to build any kind of healthy business. And I think the learning here is that, that SPAC model essentially allows companies to go public without any oversight, without any real understanding of the business. And, it was really capitalizing on a mania of retail investors wanting to have any piece of anything that was new and fresh and high growth. And when everything came collapsing down, so did IronNet right around it. And now they're being delisted. They're under $1. They haven't filed a quarterly report since October. I think, I don't know the exact timing, but I think it's 30 to 45 days, 2 months at most, you have to file your quarterly report after the end of each quarter. They haven't filed a report since October. So this company's not going to make it. It's done. It's toast. It's going to go bye-bye.
And when I look at it, I don't want to draw too many parallels to Theranos, but one of Theranos's issues was a lack of oversight. The board of directors, none of them knew anything about medical technology or medicine or anything like that. They're all just big names from you had Kissinger, you had just some really big names from either government or politics. And it's kind of the same here. Like you look at the advisors and the board, and there's a lot of ex-military on there, a lot of generals, and not a lot of folks who have built startups or cybersecurity startups before. So I wonder if that's how much of that kind of feeds into the what went wrong here.
One thing that I've seen with a lot of security products out there, and I'm not saying this was the case, but is that they seem to have a product that was built to throw out there to see what sticks, and a lot of time wasn't built with what an exact need is in mind, or what customers are actually looking for or need or are looking for. And so I think, I don't know about this specific situation, but certainly there's a lot of companies out there that are saying they do cybersecurity or they do certain types of cybersecurity, and they're backed by AI. I mean, one of the articles I think you have, Adrian, is about the Microsoft investment in ChatGPT. Like, that's really interesting. I think we're hopefully starting to see the shift from, we use AI, and everyone goes, okay, they use AI, kind of like how people say they use the blockchain, to a situation where it's like, okay, what is the AI actually doing? Let's see the tangible, practical use of that.
Yeah. Yep. Yeah, and that'll get you funding. But it's not going to get you the rest of the way.
That plus the word general in front of your name, right? That'll get you funded, especially when you promise hundreds of millions of dollars in military contracts because you are General so-and-so, It was just a fraud all the way through.
Fake it till you make it only gets you so far. I mean,
right.
Sometimes it gets you very, very far, but only gets you so far.
This was a case of fake it till you're dead. That's exactly what they did.
Yeah. Next one, I want to jump to number 7, Tyler, in case you have to leave us. I know you've got a hard stop. I wanted to get your feedback on 10 reasons for VCs to invest in a network of security leaders.
Yeah. 100%. This I skimmed the article today to support this question because I knew you would come to me. 100%. The younger the company, the more they need this kind of network of security leaders, really, and you see it happening quite a bit. There's angel groups such as the Silicon Valley Angels that are all a bunch of security leaders in Silicon Valley that have come together to fund networks. Fund companies. A lot of your VCs out there, in a general sense, will just build a security network, a network of security leaders, so that they have the constant feedback of what the market wants. It's a market representation kind of idea, right? If we have a great cross-section of the market of people who are interested in buying the products, who can demonstrate the pain, it helps the VCs know where to put their money to work. It helps the entrepreneurs and founders to know where to execute on their visions and where to take products, how to iterate things faster. This makes total sense. What I see happening here that's going to be interesting is the concept of security, a network of security leaders, or let's call it a security advisory board for a VC, that's been around for years, quite a while, actually. What I see happening that's going to be really interesting to track is when those security leaders go, why do we need the VCs? Let's just bundle our money together and invest as a group. And that's what the Silicon Valley cybersecurity angels group really is. It's a bunch of CISOs from Silicon Valley that invest all their own capital into the hottest products and then go buy the products on top of it. Right. So you get some ethical conflicts of interest that occur there. And obviously there's no requirement that they buy. But, if you're an investor in a company, you're probably going to buy the product and try to support your investment as best you can. It's just a natural connection there. So I'm not calling out, SVCI as being unethical. That's not what I'm trying to say. I'm simply saying that model lends itself to some issues of potential concern. But this, I see more and more that these network of security leaders are putting their money to work directly themselves instead of even going through VCs.
Yeah. Yeah. And just to clarify, it sounds like he's intending this for a general VC audience, not for VCs that just invest in cybersecurity companies, right? Are you reading that the same way?
I think he's just generic about it, right? The way I understood it is, look, if you're putting money to work in cyber, have intelligent people on the market around you. That's how you can distill it very basically. If you're putting money to work in finance, have a bunch of CFOs and a bunch of financial experts on your staff, and it helps you in just so many ways. I don't think Mike Prevet was really targeting any specific group with it, just stating that if you're putting money to work in cyber, you ought to have the people that are your buyers right there alongside for you.
Okay, I kind of read it a little differently, as if he was like pitching to general VCs that a network of security folks is good to have even for your like non-security investments. No, I 100% agree with that. Right. I don't know who he's writing it to, but I think it's a universal truth. Wherever you're putting money to, have expertise in your pocket. That's really what the statement is. Let's see. So, Windows 7 and Windows 8.1 are done. So, clearly we've got none of those still running anywhere in the enterprise. Those are all gone.
Oh, all over the place. See those all the time.
Windows 7 was released. Windows 7 was released October 22nd, 2009.
Wow.
Yep, still out there. Even probably a bigger deal, for at least from my perspective, is the fact that Server 2012 R2 lose support in this October, so in about 9 months. And there's still a lot of domain controllers out there in Active Directory that are running on 2012 R2, as well as 2008 R2.
Hey, on the bright side, there are probably IoT devices out there running that haven't received a firmware update since before Windows 7 came out. Right.
Today I learned, right?
Or ever, really.
Or ever, yeah. It could be 20.
What really surprised me when I looked up the release date of Windows 7. I forgot Windows 7 was the predecessor to Windows Vista. And if I remember back, Windows Vista was like, that's the game changer.
Successor, not predecessor. Successor.
Oh, it was the successor to Vista. Okay. Yeah, I misread that. You're right. I was reading it as the predecessor, and I was like, holy smokes, it was pre-Vista? That's really a long time ago.
No,
it was 2000 Me XP Vista 7.
The fact that you remember that is going to be fantastic. When you watch Jeopardy in like 10 years.
Yeah.
So someone has bingo now on the Microsoft operating system bingo. You have bingo. You're welcome.
All right. I feel like every time one of those happens, a version of Windows gets discontinued, like we're kind of required to mention on any, just in case somebody somewhere still has a Windows 7 box somewhere that's critically important for the enterprise, and they just didn't realize it's discontinued. And
every time a new version every time a new version of Windows gets retired, a butterfly gets its wings. Adrian, think of it that way.
Yeah.
For someone who doesn't watch It's a Wonderful Life, that's quite the paraphrased quote.
Is that from It's a Wonderful Life? Did I do that?
It's a paraphrase. A teacher says, anytime a bell rings, an angel gets its wings.
Wow, I had no idea. That's crazy. I just have heard the statement a bunch.
That's funny. Let's see. So number 5, I was kind of excited to see. Basically, somebody decided to, put together a website that kind of rounds up all the most popular open source security tools, which I think is pretty handy. They've got some insights into what languages they use, what license they're using. So it's kind of a cool tool.
You know what I would love to see that for? I wonder if they have historical data. I should reach out to them. I would love to know the historical data and trends on these, meaning if you could track them over time, the index score over time, it could be indicative for an investor like me. It could be indicative of new areas for investment, specifically because you're starting to see essentially rapid usage of some kind of open source component to it. And so, Metasploit framework, bad example, right? Because that's been around forever. It's at the top. It's vol management. But you could start to see like OS Query. I remember when OS Query picked up 5-6 years ago when it came out, tracking those trends of things like operating system instrumentation as a market and how quickly maybe groupings or versions of those that are kind of the similar solution are trending forward could really be useful in aiding in investment ideas.
That's a smart idea. Yeah, there's there's a Ruby linter called RuboCop.
It's pretty good.
Hey, it's open source. You can name stuff whatever you want.
It just tickled me for whatever reason. RuboCop.
Tailscale is 23rd on the list, and that's a pretty fascinating and interesting VPN project. Where you can have different VPN connections. It's super easy to set up and scale. Pretty cool.
Yeah, and I do know of a handful of investors that that's literally what they've done for the last couple of years is they looked at stars. They didn't look at even an index score. They simply looked at stars and growth of stars over time and started to look for new markets and started to look for companies that might productize an open source product.
That's super interesting.
Mm-hmm.
See, so number 8 here, this is a YouTube video. It launches you kind of into when she starts to talk about it. But M. Herrera is, she works for a VC firm. And it's a VC firm that focuses on consumer investments. But she spent, so this week in startups, so it's kind of funny, Tyler, like you got me into the All In podcast. And then that led me to This Week in Startups. Which is
Jason Calacanis's.
Yeah, Jason Calacanis's thing. And then they have this thing at the end called OK Boomer, where they've got some younger folks in the industry. Rachel Braun and M. Herrera are discussing 2023 predictions. And one of M. Herrera's predictions is personal cybersecurity. I've heard of consumer cybersecurity. First time I've heard the term personal cybersecurity, which I like better than consumer cybersecurity. But she mentioned she slots personal cybersecurity companies into 6 categories, but didn't mention what the categories were. So I immediately reached out to her. If anyone knows M, I immediately reached out to her, DM'd her on Twitter and said, hey, we would love to have you on the podcast. Haven't gotten a response yet. So if anybody knows her, I might have been too excited about it. I was like, we could talk about this, and then we could talk about this.
And she immediately went into who's that creeper mode.
Yeah, she's probably blocked me. I don't know. Maybe I was too excited.
Yeah, this is definitely the first time I've heard of personal cybersecurity. Definitely years ago, heard about cybersecurity consultants for celebrities.
Mm-hmm. Yep. I've seen 3 or 4 of those at least. I'm sure there's a lot more.
I was talking to
it's not just celebrities. I mean, major firms. Yeah, major firms will cover their executives with digital risk protection. It happens pretty frequently. if you're at a company that may do something controversial, which is almost every company, or have somebody at your company who does something executives are targets all the time. So that's what digital risk protection is, and it's a huge market.
Yeah,
and there's definitely a blend into the PR space as well. I mean, certainly if a CEO goes on a podcast of some sort and says something that's controversial, that can have a backlash to the company and stock prices.
I was talking
hypothetically, of course.
Exactly. Hypothetically speaking, I was talking to a friend of mine today, actually, and I won't mention his name because the business is an interesting business to say the least. He's got a massive business that makes significant money scrubbing personal information off of the internet for very, very famous people you've seen in movies, famous people you've seen as politicians and senators and
Xerofox.
Yeah, well, he's just doing it all by hand. He's got a small team of folks that go out and do it by hand, and they rake down absolutely fat checks, cleaning up things that people don't want available on the internet any longer. And, that's hard to do. There's certainly a lot of legal ways to do it, and there's certainly a lot of illegal ways to do that too, right? Many times you have to, he said you had to even hack into places to remove content. So, there's a market for the personal side of cyber for sure. It's just, I would love to hear how M chops it up.
Yeah, and she does talk about it some in that YouTube video, but she doesn't go into the 6 categories. So I'm left wondering what those might be. Might be something she's not planning to share, part of an investment strategy, which is fine. But I'm curious. All right, let's see. I'm going to jump back a couple of these. So we've got some trends here. We've got CloudSec trends, which I've kind of bundled together. One of them asks the questions, are threat actors gaining cloud skills faster than enterprises? Which kind of dovetails into...
Yes, they are. They absolutely are. I can tell you that cloud security is very challenging.
Yeah, I'm looking for the article, but I had one that was about free jacking, and I hadn't heard the term free jacking before, but it's basically you open up a lot of free accounts on something like GitHub, AWS, Azure, where you get trial access and you get compute based on that trial access. And basically they're stealing compute from trials. It's account fraud. Basically, I don't know if there's a better name for it, but as long as that trial exists, and they're defeating captchas, like some of the technology they're using is defeating captchas, because I saw something that said one of these campaigns was opening 3 to 5 new GitHub accounts every second, and just using the storage and the compute, from these cloud accounts, from these different SaaS accounts, to take control of stuff. Oh, it was number 15. How a single developer dropped AWS costs by 90%, then disappeared. Mm-hmm. So basically that's what he was doing, is he was taking their AWS workloads, shoving them into these free trial accounts, and then collected his check. Because a lot of times you see these where if they save the company money, they get a percentage of the money that they save them, or maybe a lump sum that they agree on in the contract. So as soon as he got his check, he disappeared. And of course, as soon as those trials ran out, that 90% savings went right back up, because you can't run those workloads in those free accounts anymore. So it all deferred back to the main account again. And often the size of the instance you're allowed to run in AWS is limited if you're on a trial as well. So I wonder if they were just using a whole bunch of them. But if you have 1 million trial accounts, who cares what the instance size is?
True.
That's true. If it's a workload that you can distribute easily, if it's designed to be distributed. Yeah, absolutely. So funny.
But no, I can tell you that it is challenging. Cloud security is a very different paradigm from on-prem stuff. So a lot of enterprises, a lot of businesses are trying to keep up with what cloud security actually means from an identity and infrastructure perspective. And the attackers are ahead of the curve on this, unfortunately.
Yeah, Tyler, what did you want to discuss with the cloud security stuff?
Oh, I didn't bring that one up.
Oh, that was Sean. Sorry.
That was Sean.
That was me.
When I look closer at the Slack, your names do look different.
I'll put a picture on there eventually, I promise.
Was that the one that you wanted to cover, Sean?
Yeah, absolutely.
All right. And then if there's anything else we cover here, we don't have to discuss it, but number 17, take some time and read number 17, like especially with the IoT conversation we had earlier. I mean, this is just, it's a lesson in the kinds of IoT mistakes that people make, specifically focused on the automotive industry. They hacked into 16 different brands or had hacks that would work on over 16 different brands of automobiles. And it's all API hacking, single sign-on type hacks, web app hacks, just crazy stuff
never
that they were able
change.
to.
Adrian, some things never change. No. Charlie, I can't remember Charlie's last name. Charlie and Valasek were the two folks.
Charlie Miller.
Yes, Charlie Miller and Chris Valasek.
Chris Valasek,
10 years ago or more, we're doing these car hacks in Vanity Fair. I mean, this is the same thing, just rinsed, repeated many times over. It's like we have not learned at all in the last decade on how to secure IoT devices, or in this case, moving vehicles.
They're not incentivized. They're just not incentivized to do it. That's all.
And this is just Sorry, go ahead, Katie.
No, go ahead.
I was going to say, this is just a group of like bored hackers and bug bounty hunters, that were like they noticed a few low-hanging fruit, and they're like, I wonder how deep this goes. I wonder how common this stuff is. And they just systematically hit the whole auto industry. And this is the result. This is 5 years of just, hey, what kind of low-hanging fruit, easy bugs can we find that allow us to unlock doors, and turn on engines and roll down windows.
They got paid well.
Yeah,
I think the issue here is monetization, right? Like, okay, these might not be the worst hacks, the hardest hacks to complete. This might not take the most time, effort, skill, whatever. But in the real world, how is an attacker, how is a cyber criminal going to monetize this versus some of the other things that they can do and monetize much more easily?
Yeah. So on the digital license plate, they could mark your license plate. A feature of this digital license plate is that if an owner's car gets stolen and it has this digital license plate on it, which is like an e-ink display, and this is only legal in California. California's made digital license plates legal, which I had no idea about until I saw this. But you can mark it as stolen. You can report your digital license plate as stolen. And when they found out they could get basically full access to the database and update whatever they wanted, they could. So you can then ransom somebody's car from them. Like, it's the classic example of like everybody's been worried about, okay, what if I get into my Tesla and there's a ransom note on the screen and I can't start it anymore. So you're almost getting into those.
You could do that, or you could hit every employee in the U.S. with phishing for the same effort.
Right. So they could hit every person who had ever bought one of those license plates, or every.
But that's a much smaller
every
pool.
Tesla owner.
But that's a much smaller pool.
Still millions or tens of thousands. Like, that's not that small.
Yeah, but I think where she's going with this is that there's no financial ROI incentive for mass compromise, and that's why you're not seeing anybody putting any time into actually fixing the problem.
Exactly.
Right. But money isn't the only, like one of the problems that we've had with mobile operating systems and stuff like that are, app stores allowing these stalker apps and stuff like that. And, an ex boyfriend or girlfriend or whatever, installs this on their partner's phone, or ex-partner's phone. Like, there's other motives that you have to protect against here.
Yeah, and a big one around stalking is one of the things here. It says that under the Hyundai Genesis list, it was fully remote, lock, unlock, engine start, stop, precision locate, honk vehicles using only the victim's email address. So if you can precision locate where a car is based on knowing the email address, that's pretty targeted. A lot of these are interesting from the perspective of the scale and scope of it. The Spyrion one is ability to fully take over any fleet which includes, they said, track and shut off starters for police, ambulance, and law enforcement vehicles for a number of different large cities and dispatch commands to those vehicles, including navigate to this location. And under Spyrion is Gold Star, LoJack, Fleet Locate, Inspire, Trailer Assist. And they noted that there were 15.5 million devices, mostly vehicles. Like, that's a big deal, especially when it impacts emergency vehicles.
Yeah, ransom a whole police station.
But you have a different kind of attacker who's going to be looking at that.
Sure. There's lots of different attackers out there.
And the incentive for that is completely different. And so much cybercrime is just based on money, and it's a lot easier to do a lot of other things. And part of the reason we haven't seen the situation change, we haven't seen the balance shift, is because these hacks theoretically could happen, but where are the attacks actually happening? What's happening in reality? What do we have to deal with first? And yeah, sure, you could I mean, there are all kinds of scenarios that could happen that are catastrophic and worst case and shutting down cities and making things horrible. But we got to deal with the things that are in our faces at much larger scale first. And I think that's really what we're dealing with here. And that's the reason that, Charlie Miller and Chris Valasek were talking about this years ago. They spoke for me many years ago when I was producing conferences, and great talk. But the reason it hasn't changed is because the incentives aren't there.
I think it's more than incentive, though. I think it's more of a newer area, a newer field. Certainly the impact is different. I mean, if you can go out and ransom a number of computers at a large company and the company's going to pay you $5 million through Bitcoin, sure, there's incentive there. I think that there's a lot of risk for different types and categories of people, as well as different types and categories of situations and organizations. Certainly fleet management of enterprise or Hertz or, a rental car company out there that has fleet management on everything, being able to get in and track certain people within that organization, that's likely happening today, whether people are tracking and ensuring that or monitoring the situation or not. So what that tells me is there's a privacy risk, much like what we were talking to Isabelle about. But to your point, Katie, until there is a financial incentive where, okay, you're going to have to pay $5 million to fix this or you don't, and that there's cyber insurance around it that you have to pay a premium to protect you or you don't, I think that definitely plays into it. So I get what you're saying. I will say that there's different motivations of attackers, and there's a lot of attackers out there that are doing things very stealthily, from the perspective of what they want to do, what they want to track and identify and get information about different people, much like the attackers that went after a large hotel chain's reservation system to identify where they were and when they were moving from place to place. That's probably my biggest concern around these sort of vulnerabilities that are in systems that have been assumed that they are okay, but as we connect more of these car systems to the internet and provide more capabilities and more technology, we end up moving into an area where there's a lot more attacker opportunity, and that's something the industry definitely needs to be aware of and start looking at. But I agree about the incentive and motivation argument that you have, Katie.
And related to this, story number 14, John Deere has agreed to stop ransoming their customers. I mean,
finally, the right to fix comes through.
Allowing U.S. customers to repair their own equipment, which has been a big deal for a while. And to give you an idea of the level of ridiculousness this gets to is if you turn your tractor on. I remember talking to Sitcodes back when he was prepping for DEF CON, and he had a bunch of vulnerabilities he found in John Deere equipment. He said if you turned your whether it's a tractor, whatever kind of equipment you have from John Deere, on and off 5 times in one day, it locks you out, and somebody has to physically come out and unlock that for you to be able to use that piece of equipment again.
Ridiculous. Absolutely.
Just because you rebooted, the OS too many times.
Ridiculous.
Yeah. So it says U.S. farmers. So apparently this only applies to the U.S. John Deere is very global. A lot of farmers in Indonesia, different countries, dealing with some of the same issues. So it'd be great to see this go more global. But it seems like we're making progress with them. Hopefully that work that SIC codes did created some goodwill and some visibility around the problems there. I think the last one we'll talk before we wrap here is number 19, passwords at the U.S. Department of the Interior. Anybody get a chance to look at this one?
I did. Yeah. So 18, it's according to this, the article says that, it's a document, looks like as part of an inspection or audit. They cracked 18,174 of the department's Active Directory user accounts, which included 288 accounts with elevated privileges and 362 senior government employee accounts. They said in the first 90 minutes of testing, their hash cracking system obtained clear text passwords for 13,924, which were 16% of about the 86,000 Department Active Directory user accounts. So, yeah, I mean, this is not surprising to me at all. Most of the passwords that are out there are bad. We do assessments for AD environments, and the vast majority of them have password minimum length requirements between 7, which is the Active Directory default, and 10. Which is just ridiculous. You can password spray and guess those pretty quickly. What they were able to do, because it's an inspection, they got the Active Directory database, were able to dump it, and then went through password cracking in order to basically brute force it. The fact that they could find so many in a short amount of time is not surprising to anyone that deals with this on a regular basis. I wouldn't be surprised if you could throw in almost any name or most names of different organizations, potentially government and others, in there, and it'd still be pretty close to valid. MFA, multi-factor, second factor, they note wasn't implemented on a number of systems that should have been there. They said 89% of its high-valued assets. Again, not surprising. Multi-factor in Active Directory is challenging, and a lot of the government systems have been shifting over to smart cards, which have been around for a very long time, using the PKI system. But as we've seen in the past couple of years, PKI can have a number of weaknesses if not set up correctly. So it's really a challenging situation. We should be focused on better systems and passwords, but it's what we have right now, right?
So the $1 million question here is, do we put more efforts into trying to get employees, maybe require more complexity, more of these audits, or do we just try to minimize the importance of passwords, and reduce our dependence on it? Like, do we put the effort in both places, or is it just time to move on from passwords and push into FIDO stuff and better methods of authentication?
I think with most things, it's nuanced, right? There's this balance. So I think that the best thing that any organization can do today is have some sort of password filtering solution to filter out the bad passwords immediately. So Azure AD Password Protection provides this. If you have an Active Directory environment and you have Azure AD, depending on your licensing, you have Azure AD Password Protection. It uses the same model that it uses kind of fuzzy logic to identify if a password is bad. So it understands that password 1 is the same as P @ SSWORD 1, and so on and so forth. And it enables you with shorter, smaller rule sets to be able to identify a lot of bad passwords, including a custom word list. So it also understands that winter 2022 is a bad password, and will force the user through the standard method to enter a password that's going to be worthwhile. NIST, in their documentation that says we shouldn't be forcing users to change passwords, actually says you should not force users to change passwords. But we also think that along with this, you should have a password filtering solution. You should also be using MFA. So it's not the situation of stop using passwords or stop forcing password reset, I guess is what I'm trying to say. It's a combination of things that will enable us to get to a better place with passwords where we're at today, until we can get to a situation where we can use FIDO2 compliant solutions, which will enable us to go passwordless.
One day, One day, eventually. All right. With that, I think that's passwords authentication. It's nuanced. I guess that's the we still have to deal with this a little bit more. Orlando 0000 was a domain administrator account. All right. And with that, thanks so much, Sean, Tyler, Katie, for joining me today. It was
Thank you,
a
Adrian.
good episode today, I think.
Absolutely.
Katie didn't notice, but we had the camera on you momentarily, Katie.
It's mostly for the
looking at
cat.
my dog who's snoring.
Yeah. Well, thank you to you, Katie.
She's mad that we went over. She wants to eat.
Okay. Well, let me wrap up and let you go. But thank you to them thank you to your pets for being patient as well. And a big thanks to everybody watching or listening to this week's episode of Enterprise Security Weekly. We will see you next week. Or will we? Okay.
2 weeks.